In the Soviet Union, disagreeing with the government wasn't just dangerous, it was a sign of mental illness. To think freely wasn't courageous, it was insanity. During the Cold War, the USSR created one of the darkest systems of repression the modern world has ever seen, the weaponization of psychiatry. Dissidents weren't just arrested, they were diagnosed. And whether you were a human rights activist, a religious believer, or someone who simply criticized the Communist Party, the Soviet state could declare you mentally ill. Your punishment? Indefinite imprisonment in a psychiatric, a psychiatric hospital for political prisoners. How did this come to be? And how did the USSR convince a society that having a different opinion was a form of madness? Let's dive in. So, the weaponization of psychiatry in the Soviet Union didn't begin overnight. Its roots trace back to the early Soviet period, when dissent itself was framed not just as a political crime, but as a sign of mental deficiency. Lenin himself had described opponents of Bolshevism as degenerates, people incapable of understanding the revolution because of their supposed psychological defects. Because after all, if you didn't like the USSR, you must have been mentally ill, right? But it was in the 1960s under Nikita Khrushchev that this idea became a fully fledged state policy. Khrushchev was embarrassed by the rising number of political prisoners in the USSR that Stalin had largely put into gulags. To the world, it looked like the Soviet Union was cracking down on freedom of speech. He also believed that it was impossible for people in a socialist country to have an anti-socialist consciousness, so any manifestation of unrest would therefore have to be a mental illness. I'm being 100% serious, by the way. There are documented statements from Khrushchev in the late 1950s and early 60s expressing frustration that those who oppose socialism must be mentally unstable, and as a result, the regime actually pivoted. During his rule, thousands of political prisoners were released from gulags and rehabilitated. However, dissent didn't disappear, it evolved. Instead of the state sanctioning people who were against the Soviet Union were literally considered to be mentally ill. Rather than imprisoning critics for political crimes, they simply declared them to be insane. Now, this had two distinct advantages. Firstly, it discredited dissidents domestically. Why would anyone listen to someone who is mad? And secondly, it gave the Soviet Union plausible deniability on the international stage. We don't have political prisoners, only patients in need of care. So, what were the prisoners actually suffering from if they were now considered to be mentally ill? Well, the USSR had an answer for that as well. Enter Andrei Senevsky, who I've actually butchered the name of, the man behind this medicalized repression, who was a powerful and influential Soviet psychiatrist. Under his leadership at the Serbsky Institute in Moscow in 1969, the diagnosis of sluggish schizophrenia was codified and institutionalized. Now, Senevsky claimed it was a uniquely Soviet discovery, an illness that could exist without typical symptoms like hallucinations or delusions. Now, let me know in the comments if this goes into crackhead territory, because the more research I did, the more I was convinced I was reading the manifesto of a true crackhead soldier. Senevsky claimed that people who had sluggish schizophrenia couldn't be detected by the untrained eye, or only by experts who could really identify who had the condition. Yep, real experts. The traits were supposed to be revealed through having behaviors like being pessimistic, having anxiety, or having conflict towards authorities. And what was the cure for having sluggish schizophrenia? A special psychiatric hospital with heavy doses of antipsychotic medication. The result was devastating. Thousands of intellectuals, scientists, artists, and religious believers were diagnosed with this fabricated condition and sent into psychiatric exile. So, what did these psychiatric hospitals actually look like? Let's take a look at some of the more famous, or infamous really, hospitals. These included the Serbsky Institute in Moscow, which I briefly mentioned before, which was the premier psychiatric hospital of the USSR. Famous Soviet political prisoners were kept here, including none other than Vladimir Bukovsky, a human rights activist. He was sent here in the 1960s. He described it as worse than a gulag because in a psychiatric, they could kill your soul. This is definitely not getting a 5-star on Google Maps, maybe like a 2 or something. To his credit, Bukovsky quite famously managed to smuggle documents from the Serbsky Institute to the West, exposing the Soviet abuse of psychiatry to the world. This immense pressure from people like Bukovsky actually made the Soviets preemptively resign from the World Psychiatric Association in 1983, and brought attention to how bad the situation actually was in the USSR behind closed doors. There were other notorious facilities in the USSR, which included the Leningrad Psychiatric Hospital No. 2 and the Kazakhstan Special Psychiatric Hospital in Chimkent, which was deliberately remote and far from international attention to prevent anyone from ever getting out. They didn't want a Bukovsky too. And fun fact, the last prisoner of war from the Second World War was actually lost in one of these psychiatric hospitals and wasn't released until 2000. Or 56 years after he was taken prisoner by the Red Army in 1944. His name was Andras Tomas, who was a Hungarian soldier and who just seemed like a bit of a lost soul. Anyway, back to the mental asylum. By the 1970s, what started as isolated cases of psychiatric abuse in the Soviet Union had morphed into a fully institutionalized system of repression, and the numbers told their own story. Because the USSR deliberately folded fake political diagnoses into official medical stats, by the 1980s the Soviet Union reported 3 times as many schizophrenic patients per capita as the United States, and twice as many as West Germany, Austria, or Japan. The city with the highest diagnosed rate of schizophrenia anywhere in the world wasn't any of the biggest cities by population, it wasn't New York or Tokyo, it was Moscow. This wasn't happening in remote rural clinics hidden from view. It was a sprawling statewide network of psychiatric prisons all operating in plain sight. The special psychiatric hospitals were placed directly under the control of the Ministry of Internal Affairs, or the MVD, the very same government body that ran the Soviet Gulag camps. This wasn't a coincidence. Soviet authorities understood something chilling. Psychiatry could do what ordinary prisons couldn't. A jail sentence could turn a dissident into a martyr. But a psychiatric diagnosis, that turned them into a joke, a non-person, someone whose ideas, human rights, free speech, religious freedom, weren't criminal, they were insane. And unlike a political prisoner, a psychiatric patient didn't need to be released. They needed to be treated. Their confinement wasn't punishment, it was help. A diagnosis was a life sentence dressed up as mercy. Inside these special psychiatric hospitals, the role of the doctor had all but vanished. Psychiatrists were no longer healers. They were state agents, enforcers of ideological orthodoxy, loyal not to medicine but to the KGB and the MVD. Diagnosis was no longer a medical process, it was a political weapon. So, how did it come to an end? By the mid-1980s, the USSR was facing growing international outrage over the abuse of psychiatry. Western psychiatrists, human rights groups like Amnesty International, and even the World Psychiatric Association openly condemned the Soviet practice of diagnosing dissidents with sluggish schizophrenia. Gorbachev's reform programs, or glasnost and perestroika, encouraged greater transparency, and that included acknowledging past abuses. This included the release of high-profile prisoners, such as Anatoly Koryagin, a psychiatrist himself, who was imprisoned for speaking out against the abuse of medicine for political purposes. Ironically, Koryagin was punished for being a doctor who refused to lie. In total though, there were 2 million people that were removed from the psychiatric registry from the USSR in 1988 and 1989. And in 1989, the Soviet Union was finally allowed to rejoin the World Psychiatric Association. But the scars never really healed. Even after the USSR collapsed in 1991, the machinery of psychiatric abuse didn't just vanish overnight. The system had been too large, and entire generations of Soviet psychiatrists had been trained not to heal, but to break people. And old habits, especially in authoritarian regimes, die hard. In the post-Soviet era, incidents of psychiatric repression began to surface again. Not on the industrial scale of the Soviet Union, but often targeted, surgical, and deeply symbolic. One of the most infamous examples came in 2012. Mikhail Kosenko, a quiet, unassuming man and a participant in an anti-Putin protest on Bolotnaya Square, was arrested for allegedly assaulting a police officer during the demonstration. There was no serious evidence against him, and witnesses said he did nothing violent, but what happened next felt like history repeating itself. Kosenko was declared mentally ill and diagnosed with a so-called chronic psychiatric disorder and sentenced to an indefinite period of forced psychiatric treatment. Human rights organizations immediately drew the connection. This wasn't about justice, it was about sending a message. And, just like the Soviet Sikushka, it was a warning. Speak out, and we'll take not just your freedom, but your sanity as well. One of Russia's most legendary writers, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, captured the horror of the psychiatric system with brutal, unflinching honesty. He said, The incarceration of healthy people in madhouses is spiritual murder. It's a variation of the gas chamber, even more cruel, and the torture of the people being killed is more malicious and more prolonged. And this wasn't just a hyperbole, because the USSR didn't just invent a fake mental illness. It created something far more terrifying. It created a reality that was defined by whatever the state said it was, and to disagree was a sign of madness. It's a reminder that when authoritarianism fears the truth, it doesn't argue with it, it calls it crazy, and it locks it away. Thanks for watching.